Good afternoon. I'm Kaushal Chari, Dean of UWM's Lubar School of Business. I'm so delighted to welcome you to today's Business Ethics webinar. The Lubar School is very proud to offer this webinar series to the public, sharing the expertise of top academics and executives and our own outstanding faculty. This webinar is sponsored by the Lubar School's M&I Center for Business Ethics. The M&I Center for Business Ethics supports an educational framework that engages Lubar students in serious thought about issues of ethics and ethical ideals that they can apply as business leaders and professionals. And through public programs like today's webinar, the center seeks to promote business ethics as critical to the success of the market-driven economy. I'm now happy to turn the program over to Dr. Richard Marcus, Associate Professor of Finance at the Lubar School of Business. Dr. Marcus is also the Interim Director of the M&I Center for Business Ethics and will be the moderator for today's webinar. So Dick, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Chari. I'm indeed eager to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jerry Davis. But during Ethics Week, which we are in, the Lubar School does announce 2 scholarships of $5,000 each for business ethics. The money from these annual scholarships comes from the Dennis and Sandy Kester Foundation. Indeed, Dennis Kester approved of the 2 candidates that a faculty committee of Dr. Maria Goranova, Ed Levitas, and I selected. Mr. Kester is retired CEO of the M&I Bank and now lives in Florida. The first I'd like to speak about is Allison Schneider. She's a marketing major and a member of the American Marketing Association with an amazing number of volunteer activities. The reviewers noted her application, her work with the River of Hope and Big Brother and Big Sister for over 4 years. She's a volunteer for Basketball for Youth, the Mighty Vikes, camp leader, and conducts haunted golf cart rides while she maintains a 3.8 grade point average. Allison embodies compassion and encouragement to others. Sydney Sampson Webb is our other winner. She is the chapter president of the Delta Sigma Pi at UWM, and it's a professional co-ed business fraternity. Last year, she was part of a team that won the Business Ethics Case Contest. She is an enthusiastic volunteer for the Ronald McDonald House, Urban Ecology Center, Milwaukee Children's Respite, and the Milwaukee Humane Society. Sydney is a double major in marketing and human resource managers, also has an entrepreneurship certificate while earning also a 3.8 grade point average. After our talk, we will have an opportunity for question and answer. So if you look at the question and answer function, that's where you can place your questions. But we are primarily here today to hear Dr. Gerald F. Davis, who is currently a fellow at the Stanford University, where Dr. Davis earned his doctorate in organizational behavior. He typically is in Ann Arbor as an associate dean, as well as being the Gilbert and Ruth Whitaker professor at the Stephen Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. Jerry is broadly trained, holding degrees in both psychology and philosophy from the University of Michigan, and earned a master's degree in Stanford in sociology. I think you will see the expansive ways that Dr. Jerry Davis will pull together changes that are occurring in the nature and ethics of work. The M&I Center of Business Ethics is proud to have Dr. Davis's talk on ethics and the Uberization of work. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dean Chari, and thank you, Professor Marcus, for that great introduction. I really appreciate it. Very excited to be here today. And congratulations to the award winners, Sydney and Allison. It's really clear that you get amazing students at UWM Lubar School. So congratulations to both of you. I hope you get a chance to celebrate and have a nice dinner somewhere socially distant, somewhere in Milwaukee. So that's great news to hear. So I'm really excited to be here in Ethics Week in particular, because I myself was a philosophy major at the University of Michigan. At the time, my mother referred to my degree program as pre-unemployment. I'm happy to say that I did eventually find work. I don't know if it's honest work, but I'm a college professor now, so I guess it worked out okay. But surprisingly enough, philosophy has turned out to be a really excellent preparation for the world that we're living in today. The world of business, the way that the economy is changing, presents so many ethical and other dilemmas. And I feel like philosophy was possibly the best choice I could have had to try to make sense of the world that we're living in now. So I want to walk you through some of my thinking around this, and then we'll have a nice dialogue toward the end. And at minimum, you'll learn 3 or 4 shocking facts about the world that you're living in today. So almost everyone that you meet would agree with this diagnosis that we're living through an era where corporate power has become huge and arguably is corrupting American democracy. There have been a series of hearings on antitrust cases against big tech and scandals. So let me walk you through a bit of this diagnosis. Corporations are expanding and consolidating in ways that concentrate economic and political power. Corporate money is corrupting our politics to favor the rich. Ineffective government regulation has tended to create a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men whose chief object is to hold and increase their power. And economic inequality is reaching unprecedented and unsustainable levels that seem inconsistent with American ideals about equality and opportunity. And a lot of people might read this and say, yeah, that sounds like the world we're living in today. It turns out that the source of this diagnosis is Teddy Roosevelt, the original trust buster, in a speech that he made in 1910 in Osawatomie, Kansas, called The New Nationalism. He was talking to veterans of the Civil War. There still were some running around at that moment in Kansas, and he was trying to diagnose what had gone wrong. The economy had just undergone this really remarkable shift towards corporatization. At the time that he was speaking, U.S. Steel had larger annual revenues than the U.S. federal government. There was no Department of Labor, there was no income tax, there was no Federal Reserve. We were living in a very different world, and Roosevelt was laying out a program to try to sort of rein in this new corporate power. I think we're living through a similar economic shift today in the organization of the economy. I'm not sure that the old diagnosis exactly works. And in fact, the surprising thing is that corporations are largely falling apart in the US. Public corporations, that is companies who have shares traded on the stock market, are disappearing. I would argue that underlying all of this is the idea that information and communication technologies, or ICTs, are reducing the costs of using outside markets relative to the cost of doing activities inside the corporate boundary. It's cheaper to hire ADP than to run your own payroll. It's cheaper to find a vendor on Alibaba than to manufacture your own pop sockets or what have you. And there's a few components of this that'll sound familiar from your business classes. So Nikification is about outsourcing production to suppliers. Uberization is outsourcing labor to contractors and temps. And Amazon is about outsourcing distribution. So if you think about what does it take to create a corporation, you need capital, labor, supplies, and distribution. All of those markets have been transformed by ICTs in ways that I think create really interesting and kind of horrifying ethical dilemmas. The last thing that I'll talk about today is what I call the web page enterprise. This is the idea of replacing management with algorithms. People talk a lot about robots taking our jobs, but I think a much more present danger or reality is that algorithms are taking our bosses' jobs, and that feels like a much more characteristic challenge today. All of this really creates pretty massive ethical challenges that require us to think more deeply about what are the values that we want to apply to this situation. How do we rein all of this in so that the economy serves human needs better? And so that's really the theme of my talk and what I've been thinking about all this year. So a unpaid advertisement from our sponsor. My last book was called The Vanishing American Corporation, Navigating the Hazards of the New Economy. And it starts with this puzzle, which is why are public corporations in the US vanishing? And for most people, you'd say that's obviously false. There's corporations everywhere you look. How can you say that they're vanishing? But in reality, if you look at the numbers, the number of public corporations in the US has dropped by over half since the late 1990s. And it wasn't just the dot-com collapse. It wasn't just the 1988 financial crisis. It's not just COVID. There's been a secular drop in the number of corporations listed on US stock markets. Well, it seems weird. You might say, well, that's because they're all buying each other up and merging. But that's not really the case. I've looked at every publicly listed corporation since 2000, and really every industry has a different story to it. The burst of the internet bubble, the banking industry. We used to have 12,000 commercial banks in the US. That seems like possibly too many. Canada has 5 banks. So there's a lot of consolidation there. Most of manufacturing has been offshored. And then there's sort of the big pharma vortex. So it's not just one story of industries becoming more consolidated. One way to get at this is to look at what were the blue chip leading premier corporations in 1988. So when I was in business school, back when I was your age, this was what the Dow Jones Index looked like, the 30 blue chip corporations. For any undergraduate on this call, you're looking at this list saying, what the heck is a Woolworth? What is a Goodyear? What is Allied Signals? They don't even recognize the names of these corporations. This was the apex of the American corporate economy in 1988, the Dow Jones 30 blue chips. These were sort of this is like the high school football team, the apex of our corporate economy. Fast forward to today, and the ones in red are the ones that are still left in the index. So it's not that they're all gone, but they've been delisted. Even Exxon has been kicked out of the Dow Jones Index. So in some sense, this is like going to your 30-year high school reunion and expecting to meet the football team. And it turns out that, a third of them have disappeared and a lot of them have gone to seed and aren't in such great shape. And GE used to be the quarterback, and now it's kind of living in a halfway house. So we kind of reached this strange situation where the big firms of the olden days have disappeared. And you might say, great, I love Schumpeter, I love disruption, the old guys are going away and being replaced by exciting new firms. But that's not true either. If you look at the number of IPOs any given year, you can see that there was a big blip in the 1990s. But like Furby's or Ace of Base or Clinton administration, the IPO boom is something that's not really coming back anytime soon. So we're really living in a different time where IPOs are not nearly the force that they were back in the day. So it's not that the exciting young firms are replacing the old firms. So that kind of leads into a question. Well, why do we have public corporations in the first place? Why do we have companies listed on stock markets? The traditional answer that you'd get in economics or in a business school is that it's about transaction costs. Ronald Coase published an article in 1937 called The Nature of the Firm. And the puzzle that he started with is, look, I'm an economist. We know that markets allocate goods to their highest and best use. And if markets are so great, why is so much of economic activity taking place within firms? Why is it that we have these giant corporations instead of just markets that get together every day? And the short answer is, which I quote here, is the main reason it's profitable to establish a firm would seem to be that there's a cost of using the price mechanism. His point was that using free markets is not itself free. you have to go out and search for alternatives and evaluate them and write up contracts and hire lawyers to do that and monitor their execution. So it's not just the price of the inputs. The firm has to manage those transactions, and there's a cost to that. And so that's why we end up having firms, is that there's a cost of using the price mechanism. And that's a starting point anyway. This is how we ended up with things like the Ford Rouge plant. So this lovely picture, when Coase was writing in 1937, both of my grandfathers were welders at the Ford Rouge plant here in Dearborn, Michigan. And you see this overview of it. At the time, it was the world's largest factory. It employed 100,000 people, which was kind of unthinkable at that time. Think about getting all those people inside the factory gates. They made their own steel, their own glass, their own cement. They had hospitals and fire departments on site. Ford owned the railroads that brought the coal up from Pennsylvania. He owned rubber plantations in Brazil to bring the rubber to put into the tires of the cars. And so it was a hyper vertically integrated factory. And Coase said, this is why there's a cost of managing those transactions. You really couldn't do that externally. But imagine a sort of thought experiment. What if everybody carried with them a tiny supercomputer communicator that allowed them to look up the prices for everything in the world all day, every day, and they could create contracts for inputs with random strangers and track their performance in real time? Imagine this science fiction world where everyone carries with them a device that allows them to look up prices. From Coase's perspective, this is prices asymptotically approaching zero. The transaction costs of contracting go down. Well, what happens in a world where the price of contracting goes down, where transaction costs head towards zero? You end up with a world with a pervasive outsourcing of the production of goods and services. I call this Nikeification. As you all know, from the beginning, Nike did not manufacture the sneakers with its name and its swoosh on it. It used vendors in East Asia to produce them. They did the design and marketing, but they didn't do the heavy lifting of production. So that model that Nike pioneered really spread broadly in the US, particularly during the 1990s. And it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that almost nothing you buy in the US today is made by the company whose name is on the label. The best-selling brand of flat screen television in the US in 2010 was not Samsung, it was not Sony, it was Vizio, created by an entrepreneur in Irvine, California, that saw that all the parts were available off the shelf, the same insight that Michael Dell had about PCs. And so he could hire a vendor in China to produce televisions and distribute them through Costco. He ended up having a company with just 200 employees and the biggest market share of flat screen televisions in the US. Mobile phones, we all know, are made by Foxconn and others, not by Apple. Pet food is mostly made by Menu Foods in Ontario, Canada. Tomato sauce, it turns out that if Professor Marcus has Marcus's delicious garlicky basil cheesy tomato sauce recipe from his great grandmother, you can contract with a company called Ledestri in Rochester, New York, send them the recipe and a label design, and they'll switch over their highly automated factory to make your tomato sauce recipe and get it onto the shelves of stores. They make Newman's Own, they make all kinds of different tomato sauce brands. So you don't need to buy the factory to have your name on the tomato sauce. Heparin, of course. CIA assassinations these days are more likely to be done by contractors rather than necessarily by the CIA. Seriously, you can find vendors for everything. So that's become kind of a commonplace. We're familiar with that idea. What happens when this moves to the labor market? And that's Uberization. So this is an article from 6 years ago called "There's an Uber for Everything Now." And it became a cliche almost immediately that here in the Bay Area, where I'm speaking to you from, anything that any human being can do for another human being, there is an app for that. This article says I've got a maid, masseuse, doctor, chef, valet, personal shopper, florist, and bartender. They all have an app and they can show up at my house in 10 minutes. One of my favorites here in Silicon Valley was, or at least in San Francisco, there was a valet parking app. So for the tech bros with Teslas that don't know how to parallel park for themselves. You can show up in front of the building, call up the app, and some sociology major will show up on a skateboard and park your car for you. So there really is an Uber for everything. But the significance of Uber, from my perspective, is not that you can get a ride to the airport a lot more cheaply. I define Uberization to be about spot markets for labor. So Uberization is the creation of spot markets enabled by smartphones in which the buyers and sellers can contract for the performance of specific tasks. So the significance of Uberization is transitioning from a world of jobs to a world of tasks where you can pay people by the task rather than hiring them for a full day or as an actual full-time job. That to me is the most significant, even if Uber itself, as you may have learned in your accounting or finance classes, it's not clear that that is a model that will sustain itself for the Uber Corporation. But the idea of hiring labor by the task, I think that's something that's here to stay. So why do I have a picture of the Home Depot parking lot? It's not because they're in Atlanta and have not written any letters to the Georgia legislature recently. This is a picture of a bunch of young gentlemen hanging around in the Home Depot parking lot. And in California and other places in the world, you're likely to see a bunch of young men milling around between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. And you might think, are they playing Pokemon Go, or is this a religious group, or they're waiting to go on a camping trip? What are these guys doing here? And it turns out that it's a spot labor market. If you want to hire a bunch of people to do a job, and you're paying cash at the end of the day, and you don't require documentation, that's the Home Depot parking lot. It's kind of the agreed on, the focal point for spot labor markets for the day. So if you're building a garage and you need some people to help you out, you say, I need someone who can mix cement. I'm paying $80 for the day. I need a carpenter. That's $120 for the day. I need a roofer. That's $115 for the day. And you can recruit your crew. And I'll give you a moment to read this. This is my favorite cartoon in the New Yorker. It's the Office Depot with a bunch of guys in white shirts and ties waiting to be recruited for a white collar crew. It's funny because it's true. The white collar world has already been overtaken by temps, vendors, and contractors. As you may know, Google has more temps, vendors, and contractors than they do employees. Last year, they had 102,000 employees, 120,000 contractors, the ones that are wearing the red badges. And that's true across the white collar world. People are working for Adecco or as independent contractors more so than working for the company whose name is on the label. So we already live in a world of temps, vendors, and contractors. What's interesting about Uber is that Uberization turns the world into a Home Depot parking lot. Imagine not having to show up at the parking lot, but pulling up an app saying, I need to recruit a crew to create a garage today. Here's what I'm looking for. And then within a few milliseconds, people have signed up and taken the job, and they show up at the job site. One of the problems that your HR professors will tell you about is, well, how do you know if they're doing a good job? It's one thing to show up at the Home Depot parking lot and say, that's a human being, but how do I know if they're good at their job? So those of you who, like me, love dystopian fiction may remember Black Mirror Season 3, Episode 1, Nosedive, which is morose and depressing, so don't go watching it. The award winners definitely don't watch this. It'll bum you out for the rest of the day. But it sort of visualizes a world where after every interaction, people are prompted to rate each other as human beings. And every person has a score based on the ratings that they get from the others that they interact with. And then it spins out what are the implications of a world like that, everyone wearing pastel and having fake smiles. But I can tell you that there are consulting firms as we speak that are implementing this across corporate America. So it won't be that long in the future where you go to the mall, if there are still malls, you walk into a store and you will be asked to evaluate the person who helped you, the salesperson or the checkout person. So I want to sort of imagine another one of those thought experiments that I love so much. By the way, this was philosophy professors love thought experiments. They love things like the trolley problem. So thought experiments are kind of pervasive in philosophy. So imagine that Walmart wanted to be rid of all those pesky employees and go to an all contractor world. How would they pull that off? So at the moment, Walmart has 2.2 million employees. It's the world's largest employer. And if you track this, every time Walmart announces we're going to raise the minimum that we pay people, or we're going to invest heavily in training, their stock price goes down. For some reason, Walmart does not, or Wall Street does not seem to love paying people well or investing in human capital. And companies can take it on the chin for being good employers. So imagine that Walmart wanted to go lean, or really lean, and be rid of as many employees as they could. So here's a way they might do that. Their associates, as they call employees, could transition to self-employed micro entrepreneurs organized as limited liability companies. Turns out that in most states, you can create an LLC for about $50 online. It's very easy to create a legal shell, and it creates some advantages for employers if they're saying you're not an employee, you're a contractor. Having an LLC makes it look a little bit more legit to the authorities. The training would be self-funded and provided by community colleges or third-party vendors like Amazon. And people would get certifications, kind of like your LinkedIn profile. They would have little badges for specific roles that they were qualified to fill, like checkout or warehouse or shelf stocking. So you can fulfill any of those roles. The evaluations would be automated based on how quickly you do it. Did you check in and check out promptly? And how did customers rate you on that smartphone app? And here's the genius or horror part, depending on your perspective. Suppose that anybody that had a rating greater than 4.5 could use the uServe app to bid for shifts within a commutable distance. And the idea is, if you want to figure out your schedule for the next 2 weeks, instead of an algorithm assigning you to a set of shifts, you would pop open the app and say, I want to work Thursday during the day, Friday during the day, Saturday evening, and you would look around for all the stores within 20 miles and then place your bid for what you're willing to accept to work for that particular shift. And then the algo would choose the low bidders that are above a certain quality threshold and staff the shifts in that way. So you could imagine that contractors might be getting $5 an hour on Thursday morning because everybody wants to work then, but $30 an hour on Saturday night because that's surge pricing. Nobody wants to work then. And so the magic of the market would seep into how much you get paid on a daily and maybe an hourly basis. And it would be subject to market forces instead of being protected from them the way that Coase described. And how would you sell this idea? Well, be your own boss, choose your own hours, codependent, no more, would essentially be the same pitch that Uber uses to recruit labor. So I've spun this thought experiment on many occasions, and about a year and a half ago, I was giving a talk to Canadian executives in the lovely hotel in Banff, up in the Rockies in Alberta. And they all made this giant face and said, that is ridiculous. That is the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Society would not put up with this idea of shifts on apps and trading, and it's just ridiculous. This is the kind of thing you'd expect from a college professor to think that this kind of thing could ever happen. So within 2 weeks of giving this talk, Walmart rolled out the My Walmart Schedule app that allows workers to trade shifts with each other. So if you say, I got a medical emergency, is anybody willing to swap with me? You could use this app to do that. It's not bidding yet, but it's pretty close down the road. And about a week after that, Uber launched a service called Uber Works, which is exactly what I described. Firms that need employees can list a shift on this app, and then people can go to the app and say, am I qualified for this? What's my rating? How much are they paying? It's not a bidding system quite yet. And what clothes do I need to wear? When do I start? And so there is now an app that looks not all that different from my little thought experiment there. And I want to pause at this moment to point something out that is that's very important to me, and that I think we're going to be seeing into the distant future. the employment relation in the United States is on the verge of a vast transformation that I think is going to be mostly a disaster for labor, at least in the US. So I'm in California this year, and in November, the voters of California voted in favor of Proposition 22, which allows Uber and Lyft to continue to classify their drivers as contractors and not employees. Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, a couple of others spent $200 million passing this law. The law included something of a poison pill that said this bill cannot be repealed without a 7/8 vote of the legislature. So essentially, it's a bill that can never be repealed. The only way to be rid of it, apparently, is for the Supreme Court to rule it inappropriate or unconstitutional. But what Uber and Lyft did the next day is say, all right, we did this in California, now onward to the rest of the US. Those of us old enough to remember Proposition 13 in the tax revolution knows that California is very often the vanguard of creating mischief in the rest of the country. So I think this is going to be in the next couple of few months and years, this is going to be a pretty epic battle about whether we're going to see the world that I envisioned on that last slide or whether those Canadian executives are right. Shortly after that bill passed in California, the big grocery chains in California threw out of work their delivery drivers, union drivers who got a pretty reasonable wage, and transitioned to using DoorDash instead. So the effect was pretty immediate. Companies that could move to an Uberized workplace did so pretty quickly, at least in California. So this is something we're going to be seeing more of in the future that raises, I think we will say, a lot of issues around ethics and around democracy. I want to give a sort of a follow-up to this. It's not just supplies, it's not just labor. Of course, this also takes place in the market for distribution. So Farhad Manjoo is a columnist for the New York Times. He's a brilliant commentator on technology and Silicon Valley and the world that we're living in today. And this is an article that he wrote a couple of years ago that I assign to all of my doctoral students. And every student that I can get a chance to, I send them to read this article because it creates existential angst for those of us in business schools. It's describing a business model that seems to render problematic an awful lot of what we teach in business schools. So it's describing, Farhad bought a web camera for $20, and he said, how is it conceivable that, I mean, this thing works and it's pretty good. How is it possible that they're making this for $20? And he dug into the industry and discovered that there's an entire sector of firms that essentially consist of 3 guys hanging around in a warehouse, finding things with high margins on Amazon, hiring a designer on Upwork to design a good knockoff, and hiring a vendor at Alibaba to manufacture it and listing it on Amazon.com. And so they're not really in an industry. Their industry is finding stuff that's overpriced, where there's a margin, and finding a way to produce it for cheaper. Because if customers are willing to buy Vizio instead of Sony, because it's almost as good, but it's a lot cheaper, that basic disruptor principle applies pretty broadly across industries. I might love a Hugo Boss suit. Well, all right, that's a bad example. There's an awful lot of industries, such as he says down here, lamps, humidifiers, cosmetics, where people would be willing to buy a knockoff brand that's almost as good, but a lot cheaper. And so he comes to this fun conclusion that we're going to get better products for ridiculously low prices as big brands are outcompeted by disruptors. And so we're on the verge of this wave where brand names don't matter nearly as much as they used to, as long as you've got something with good Amazon reviews and it turns up high in the rankings. So the existential angst for for business schools is, well, why teach logistics if it consists of hiring someone from Alibaba and hiring Amazon to do the distribution? Why teach marketing if it's a matter of just getting a high ranking? That's search engine optimization and getting good reviews. Why teach finance or financial accounting if there's no reason to go public because you're never going to buy a factory? Why HR if you're never going to hire any people? So this to me makes me a little bit woozy to see this sort of interesting situation. He's an optimist about it. You could also ask, maybe competitors on Amazon decide to use sleazy, underhanded tactics in a market that doesn't have a legitimate court system to adjudicate how competition works. If you sell on Amazon, you're going to use binding arbitration and not the US court system. And turns out, of course, this is true. It is really the Wild West on Amazon, where some vendors are producing great products at great prices that their customers love, and others are saying, what do we do to go, what do we do to kneecap these competitors? How do we steal their trademark name from them? Or how do we create a product that's almost as good, but that gets higher rankings during the search? How do we go Tonya Harding on the competitors? And that's kind of the world that we're working through right now, is this world of really wild competition on Amazon. Well, this is, if you're an entrepreneur, this is the most interesting time possibly in human history. One of my mentors at Stanford is John Mayer. He published an article in 1977 saying the building blocks for organizations come to be littered about the societal landscape. It takes only a little entrepreneurial energy to assemble them into a structure. And when he wrote this 44 years ago, it was poetic, but it wasn't true. I mean, it sounded beautiful, like the world was just a bunch of Legos waiting to be assembled, but it wasn't really true. You know, the world was dominated by giant conglomerates that were undervalued on the stock market, but the notion that you could just snap things together, now it is almost literally true. So the story I've told so far is that through pervasive Nikeification, American corporations have outsourced pretty much every activity that they used to do internally. Because of Uberization, this has been extended to labor at all levels of skill. It's not just driving to the airport. One of my colleagues here at Stanford got some pretty serious back surgery, and he interviewed the surgical team and discovered that they lived all over the country. They flew in here because the money was better. A bunch of them would rent a Motel 6 room together and sort of swap the beds while they did shifts, because they could make a lot of money in Silicon Valley, but they lived in Arizona or Alabama or Colorado, and they came in here to do temp shifts as surgeons. So this is going to happen at all levels of skill. And Amazon enables anybody to sell to a global market. So we've arrived at this situation where anyone with a credit card and a web connection can create a firm with minimal startup costs. And that sounds ridiculous. Let me walk you through an example really quick here. The example is the Instant Pot. And I have to tell you that the Instant Pot is one of the greatest inventions in all of human history. I love the Instant Pot. I don't normally do advertisements other than for my own books, but I love the Instant Pot. We use it 10 times a week. You can take rock hard chickpeas to delicious and tasty in about an hour. It's basically a pressure cooker computerized, and you can get it on Prime Day for, $50. The thing is really an amazing. I mean, since the microwave, it is kind of the only essential new kitchen appliance. Maybe a immersion blender, but no, this is more important than that. It's really a very useful product to have, and I'm not getting paid for this. So the story of the Instant Pot is pretty interesting. It was created by a guy named Robert Wang, who was an unemployed computer engineering PhD. And after the crisis of 2008, he looked around and said, what does the world need? Yet another dating app, or a way to cook healthy foods quickly for busy people. And that's what he did. He self-financed this business himself, $350,000, him and some designers, to create a computerized, computer-controlled pressure cooker, and got it of course, produced by someone on Alibaba. I'm not sure exactly whom. His marketing consisted of sending Instant Pots to 200 influential food bloggers and cookbook authors. And then he reads all of the Amazon reviews. If you go to their Amazon page, they have tens of thousands of reviews. He claims to have read every one of them because that is his consumer research. He sees what people liked and what they didn't. He takes that into account as he evolves the design. The distribution was fulfillment by Amazon. They pick the stuff up at the dock and bring it to your home. In 2019, they sold over 300,000 on Prime Day alone. So to put this in context, 300,000 is a lot. The category is now arguably $300 million a year. So he's invented a new product category from scratch that's pretty much indispensable. And the kicker that they produced, they employed just 50 people outside of Ottawa. So the company is tiny. It has essentially no assets, very few employees, but a big footprint on the world because he has snapped together all of these parts to create one of these enterprises. Fascinating and troubling for those of us in business schools, but fascinating for those of you who are entrepreneurial minded, that you don't need to raise a fortune to be able to create an enterprise that's pretty impressive. Now, admittedly, $350,000 is not nothing, but you don't necessarily, you don't need to get a giant venture capitalist. This is not like WeWork money to get this thing going. What comes next is what happens when ICTs invade the firm itself. And the answer, as I see it, is the webpage enterprise. And this is a trademarked phrase that I myself invented in a law review a few years ago, the webpage enterprise. So those of you that are elderly, such as myself, and maybe Professor, well, I'm not going to say anyone. No one else is old enough to remember Circuit City. Imagine Best Buy with a different logo and a less attentive sales staff. If you had to read Good to Great in your strategy class, apologies to you for that. This is one of the exemplars of a great company that went from good to great, Circuit City. They were liquidated in January 2009, so they went from good to great to liquidation. But a company on Long Island called Systemax went to the bankruptcy auction, bought the name Circuit City, the logo, and the web address circuitcity.com, and recreated the original website, selling all of the same stuff that Circuit City used to sell in their retail stores, but then connected it to third-party fulfillment services. So you could buy all the same stuff you got from Circuit City, but from a website. So it was literally a firm with no employees. It was just a website that fulfilled the same functions that Circuit City used to do. Well, that's kind of interesting as a proof of concept. And this is, if you are elderly like me, you think that the web exists out there in the world, that web pages are like books at a physical bookstore just waiting for you to view them. But you savvy young people know that the web page, you've right-clicked on the web page and viewed the source material for this, and you realize that web pages don't exist until they are called into existence by your browser. When you go to that address, it says, all right, you're using an iPhone with the following operating system. Your IP address shows that you're in Menlo Park, California. And it gets some identifying details from you and then creates a web page on the fly at the moment by creating a set of calls on resources out there in the world. So if you look at the underlying HTML code, it's saying, go to this SQL database and pull this picture of the Visio. Go to this database and find out what our current price is. Go to this API and pull down the weather information. So in some sense, what a web page does is what a firm does. A web page is a set of calls on resources that are combined to create an output. And so a web page really is not that different from what a firm does. And so I think it's a useful metaphor for how we think about the future of work. Imagine that the resource that the web page is calling on is not a SQL database, but a labor market app to get people to show up to do a particular task. And you could visualize going to a web page and saying, I want a 60-inch television screen mounted on this wall before the next Super Bowl. So by this date, I'm going to go to the web page, put in what I want, and then 2 milliseconds later, it goes out and finds how much for a screen, how much for a processor, how much to assemble it, how much to ship it, how much to get guys to pick it up at the dock and mount it on your wall. And then 2 milliseconds later, you've got a price for that thing. That sounds insane at this moment, but it is not insane. The notion that you'd pull out your phone and then a cab would show up sounded insane 12 years ago, and now we completely take it for granted. You can imagine web pages essentially replacing the firm itself by fulfilling some of those same functions. And so the definition of a web page enterprise, it coordinates inputs to create outputs through software and algorithms rather than through hierarchy, much the same way that a web page coordinates calls on resources to create the output on a browser. And as I've described, firms have already laid down the tracks for the web page enterprise through what I call Nikification and Uberization. They've already created the elements. The only question really is who's going to design these things. The bonus is there's no need to go public. If you don't have employees, if you don't have assets, if you're a web page, you don't need to go to the public markets and go through an IPO or reveal how much your CEO is paid or create that Section 1A with all of the risks to the business. There's a real advantage to being a web page rather than a publicly traded corporation. All right, this is sounding Black Mirror-ish. So I want to close with 3 of the dilemmas that I see that are created by this situation. So because I'm a philosophy major, I try to take ideas and make them as complicated sounding as possible so you will think that I am smart. So what counts as a firm these days? I described Visio. It's kind of a node in a broader mesh. It's a node in the supply chain that coordinates the other nodes. Does that count as a firm? Well, sort of. How low does it have to go? If you get to the point of being a web page, if Visio becomes the web page that I visualize, is it still a firm or is it something else? We're used to thinking of firms the way that you think of NBA teams. They've got an identity, they've got a brand, they hire players, they have regularly scheduled games. But I'm describing a world that looks a lot more like pickup basketball. There is no ongoing identity. Stuff comes together, a game gets played, and then they break apart and something else happens. Well, we don't really have the language, the vocabulary necessarily to talk about a world that looks like that. I have a fun example here that was in the New York Times about this woman that rents a tiny living workspace in I think in Brooklyn, and she runs 6 companies out of her workspace. So she hand paints bicycle helmets and sells those on the web. She has pedal bikes that can be used as a vendor to go to fairs and things. She rents those out to people. And she's got 4 other businesses. She's in 160 square foot. Oh, she's not in Brooklyn. She's in the East Village, but she's in a tiny space, and she is 6 firms herself. That's pretty different. That makes us think about what is a firm and what is responsibility in that situation. Well, the second dilemma is really about ethics, which is the theme of this week that we've had here. Who is responsible for harms? So I mentioned that philosophy professors love thought experiments. The one that they either love or hate is the trolley problem. If you've seen the extremely excellent show, The Good Place, you have seen the trolley problem. If you haven't seen The Good Place, highly recommended that you watch it start to finish. It's really fun. At minimum, you could probably use your search engine to find the episode about the trolley problem, which is kind of grotesque and bloody, so maybe you don't want to watch it. But it's kind of a fun thought experiment. And I hope I've whet your appetite enough that you now want to look up the trolley problem and argue with your friends about it. But when I was taking my ethics class way back in 1983 at the University of Michigan, the professor had this comical example of an ethical dilemma. And he'd say, well, imagine every time I step on this particular floor tile, a child on the other side of the world gets a painful electric shock. So like, why would you say that? That's a Why would you give us this horrible idea? He goes, yeah, but imagine here I am stepping on it. Oops, but I'm not aware of it. So am I responsible? Am I culpable for the wrongs created by this? And that was the kind of thought experiment that he loved. Well, we now live in a world where every trip to the grocery store is a lot like the thought experiments that my ethics professor used on me. And so imagine that you are a student at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, and you have been in lockdown for months and months. You're having no human contact. You're not talking to your roommate anymore because you fell out months ago, and you've decided you need some kind of human contact, and you're sick of Zoom, but you also don't want to sort of violate the school rules, so you get a kitten instead. Kittens are adorable, aren't they? And you decide you want to keep your kitten happy by going to Kroger and buying some fancy feast seafood flavored cat chow to keep your kitten happy. And even though you don't have the money, you're splurging to get your favorite brand of this cat chow, which makes the kitten very happy. It turns out that the brand Ralston Purina was bought by Nestle. Nestle, of course, relies on contractors. And the shrimp that go into the seafood flavored cat chow, the company has admitted, is caught by slave labor off the coast of Thailand. I have just bummed you out and ruined your day by telling you that you thought you were doing a good thing by buying this seafood flavored cat chow. But in fact, when we buy this particular brand, we are enabling slavery. As you could say, WTF. What is the factor behind this moral dilemma? How do I address something like this? Am I really responsible, or can I claim it's somebody else? Does that mean that ignorance really is bliss? And so what I should be doing is learning as little as possible. I learned this morning that 1/5 of the world's cotton is created by Uyghurs in China. I personally do not want to buy cotton that is made under police state conditions by persecuted minorities. How do I know if the cotton going into my clothes at Costco are made under these circumstances? That is the dilemma that we're now facing in this world of dispersed supply chains. Last one here, I swear, is about epistemology. Who or what can know things? What does it mean to say a company knows? So Nestle was approached by activists who said, hey, you realize that slaves are creating, that your seafood flavored cat chow is implicated in slavery. And they said, how do we know that that's true? They spent 9 months investigating it and discovered, yep, sure enough, that is true. We need to do better with our supply chains. But what does it mean for a company to know things? The Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 required companies listed on US stock markets to report on their use of conflict minerals, tantalum, tungsten, tin, and gold, coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the idea was that if companies had to report on where their tantalum comes from, they would and had to say, yep, we are funding warlords, they would stop doing that. So you're not required not to use tantalum, which, by the way, all electronics in the world essentially use tantalum. The thought was if companies had to publicly tell the world, yep, we're funding warlords, they would stop doing it. They would put the work in to no longer using conflict minerals. I did a paper several years ago with Young Hyun Kim, a doctoral student at the time, now a faculty member. He's a genius and did all the hard work and had all the good ideas, as is true with all my co-authors. We discovered that only about 1 in 100 corporations could tell with certainty that they didn't use conflict minerals. And the next year, 1 in 100. The year after that, 1 in 100. And we were like, how is it possible that Apple, a $2 trillion company, can't tell if their minerals are safe or not? And when we dug into it, we discovered that dispersed supply chains, if it's 5 steps back in a supply chain, you have no idea where that stuff is coming from. It's a surprisingly difficult problem. So I want to end with this lovely painting. This is a picture called Girl with Flower. If you come to visit us in Detroit, Michigan, which I recommend that you all do, it's fantastic. It's like Milwaukee, but with a river instead of a lake, and a lot of great history to it. I'm a big Detroit patriot. Our Art Institute is amazing. This painting, Girl with Flower by Fernand Léger, shows this intricate pattern in black paint of this woman's face, and she's wearing a necklace. She's got a shawl, and you can see a little sort of the neckline of her dress. And then there's this very strange looking jagged flower. It's a very intricate pattern. And then you've got these very simple color blocks of red and orange and yellow and green and blue that don't match onto the elaborate pattern that we're seeing of this woman in the flower. And to me, that's a pretty good metaphor for the situation that I have just described. We've got these very simple categories to understand the world, like firm or employee or industry. But then we've got the reality that just doesn't match onto the simple boxes that we want to stuff it into. And that's kind of the thing that's creating some dilemmas for us. So the categories we use to try to map our economy, I think, are largely out of date. They don't map onto the world that we're experiencing. Am I an employee or am I a contractor? That's a sort of a definitional issue. Corporate structures look very different now, and they require different tools to tame them. I think I'm excited about the new antitrust movement, but I think they're getting a bunch of things wrong, that they're stylized facts, I think, are not capturing the way that the economy is really working these days. And I think I've given you a bit of a leg up by describing these different markets. And we're sort of figuring out, what will the future look like? How do we tame corporations? How do we create a system that promotes human values, that creates an ethical system, given that firms and employees and the world just looks different than it used to? And I would advocate for optimizing for democracy and economic security and not shareholder value this time. If you saw the debate last week with Ed Freeman and Anant Sundaram and Ed Zajac, I enjoyed that very much and was happy that the school put that together. But I think shareholder value has really led us astray. I've for years have ended my talks asking, where is the workplace democracy app that will turn General Motors into a kibbutz? That sounded crazy the first time I said it, but increasingly I think it sounds reasonably plausible. So thank you very much. I know I've tested your patience with a very long talk with a lot of crazy stuff, but I would love to hear any questions and thoughts and get the dialogue going.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear what you're talking about, and I've already designed a new ketchup. It's going to be a gallon of ketchup. It's going to be a cup of Worcestershire sauce and a quarter cup of hot sauce, and I'm going to call it Dick's special ketchup. And I'll try that out sometime.
We have got the hookup. You know, Worcestershire sauce is not vegetarian, so for anyone on the call, it's got salty little fish from off the coast of Chile. So careful there.
We have two real interesting questions from John Stillen. The first I want to give you is, should I invest in a flexible factory that does contracting manufacturing of anything? Sort of, I'm going to make it for you.
So I think flexible manufacturing is 100% the future. I think that the world that we're going to see, in a world where distribution is increasingly going to be done by Amazon or by Walmart, if that's the way that products are sold, then it makes, instead of investing everything in a factory that makes one specific good at the cheapest sort of per unit cost, the advantages of a flexible factory is, if in the fall everyone's interested in fidget spinners, and a few months later everybody wants to shift to Frisbees or tiny electronic phones that live in your ear, flexible factory will allow you to shift from one business to another. So I foresee the world shifting from companies that are primarily designers and marketers that look like Nike. They're the ones that are researching and creating the new products, and then a world of manufacturers, and that has to look something like flexible manufacturing. And the advantage of this is, if you work with what used to be called OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, but ironically, it refers to the company that owns the brand name and then contracts out the production. But I think we're going to see a world where there will be generic manufacturing, and the winners will be the companies that are really quick at doing changeovers. They can produce high quality, guaranteed goods, but shift from product to product. That's essentially what Foxconn does. They make PCs, laptops, routers, cell phones. I think there's that's likely where the future is going to be. So that was a very long version of yes.
Yes, it's definitely yes. He also, John Stillen also asks, is creating jobs the role of corporations and businesses?
It depends on the corporation and business. I think if SC Johnson were in the room, they would say, yes, we have we are a family business and we have a long lasting commitment to the community. And that means the team members that work here. If that company were Netflix, they would say 100% no. We exist to create cash. If you are at the top of your game, you can keep working here. If you start to slip or we change our priorities, we'll give you a really nice recommendation for your next job. The problem created by this is, if you have visited San Francisco anytime in the last few years, you see massively wealthy tech bros and you see homeless people living in tents under the street. And I don't think that we as a civilization want to live in that world. So it may not necessarily be the job of corporations, but if corporations aren't going to do it, then I think we need to create a much more comprehensive social welfare safety net that keeps people from living in poverty. That people can't survive in a world where their wages shift from day to day. If you're a contractor and you want to get a mortgage, there can be some real issues around that. And so if we want to allow companies to hire and fire at will, as they do in Denmark, then we need to have a social safety net that looks like the one they have in Denmark. That if you lose your job, either you're terrible at it or nobody wants to buy fidget spinners anymore, then there has to be some basic level of security provided by that society. I think that would include access to healthcare. In the US, we have insanely tied health insurance to your employer. That works at General Motors in 1970, where you're going to work there for the rest of your life. That doesn't work at the fidget spinner company, where you're going to work there for 2 months until kids move on to the next fad. So we need to have some basic level of security if we want to live in a civilization. So I think that includes access to healthcare, either a reasonable unemployment system or a universal basic income, and low-cost access to higher education, such as the University of Wisconsin at Madison's Lubar School of Business. I would love to see society invest more in higher education so that we can move up in the world. Because task jobs, there is no job ladder. You don't go from being Uber driver to being Uber coder. They're not going to train you in Python and SQL and those core skills. And so it is a corporation's job in a world where there's no other safety net. We could imagine another equilibrium, but if we want civilization, we got to have some security built in. Sorry for another very long answer, but
no, that's very good. I was thinking about the 2.2 million people working at Walmart and getting their $50 LLC and then becoming entrepreneur workers. What if some people don't really want to be, a business of themselves and report the things that they'd have to report, that they just want to be a worker? What's going to happen to those people who are not as flexible as that?
It is really a political choice on our part. We create the terroir, the soil for the kind of organizations that we have, and we can create a world that makes it attractive to be a long-term employer and to promote people and train them. We can create a world that makes it as unattractive as possible to be an employer. I think in the US, we've made it very unattractive to be an employer. So crazy number, the average employer insurance, the cost for the average employer to provide health insurance to a head of household and their family is $21,000. So before the person has done a lick of work, before they've been paid by the hour, $21,000 for a year of insurance for a head of household. That is the median pay at Target and at Home Depot. And so who in their right mind wants to hire people if they have to cover that kind of nut? So I think that we can create the world that we want to live in. We can create a world where the folks that want to be entrepreneurs and want the excitement of something different any day can do that. And the people that just want to check in, do their work, and then check out at the end of the day, we could imagine creating a world that had both those options. But that's really a political matter. We create the laws that gestate or that incubate the firms that we have. So, yeah.
I was thinking about that cartoon at the office depot, finding somebody doing spreadsheets. But Milwaukee is the headquarters of Manpower, which essentially finds people that are doing different tasks, somehow sorts through them that they're acceptable, and then lends them out. So that's been going on for many years, because when I was 18-year-olds, I worked for Manpower myself for a while in Michigan. So I was wondering if this has already been going on for longer than just immediate.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I too, at age 18, worked at Kelly Services in Michigan in a sad factory in Detroit. I lasted 2.5 days, and then I said I can't do this anymore because it was so boring. But one of my buddies was the CEO of Kelly Services for several years, and I had him come speak to my group at the Ross School of Business. And he said, Kelly Services is the largest employer of PhDs in the United States. He said, there's no way that's true. That cannot be true. But he's an honest man, and actually has a PhD in spite of being an honest man. So he had been an academic before being a business guy. And he said, no, it's absolutely true. We are one of the major suppliers to drug companies of people with PhDs in biology and MDs to do drug testing. So if Merck or Pfizer wants to hire people to do a drug test, it's a highly interoperable task, as we nerds like to say. It looks the same at any company that's going to do these things. And so they'll say, we need somebody to work for 3 months on X or 6 months on Y. And they don't want to hire full-time people for that. And so they hire a crew to do that particular test. And they hire them from Kelly. They said they changed their view to being, from being Kelly girls from in the olden offensive days to the talent supply chain provider. That it's kind of their job to get you the people you need, whether full-time as employees or part-time or for fixed terms. And as you said, that's been going on for a very long time. The idea that companies don't like to hire people or pay them, that didn't just happen in the last couple of weeks. That's been very true since at least the late 1980s, that companies had a lot of incentives to have as few people on the books as possible and to use temps and contractors instead. So yeah, it's what's more wonderful or horrifying, depending on your perspective, is the notion you can do this through an app. And you can do it for doctors, by the way. I don't know if you've tried this, but imagine you wake up in the morning at 6 o'clock and say, oh, I might have I got a UTI, or I've got a headache, or maybe it's the flu. There are services that you can go to on the web that will call someone up on Zoom, a licensed physician who's trying to pay back their college loans for medical school, and they will say, "Show me your symptoms. All right, put the camera down your throat for a minute. Yeah, you got strep throat. Here's a prescription to your local Walgreens," and you can go and do that. I mean, it's basically Uber for medical care. And in the pandemic, so many people have shifted to telehealth that this might be our future, that a lot more people are going to be using Zoom for their medical visits. And that makes it feasible to have contractors rather than full-time doctors.
I liked some of the fancy words you were using, ontology, and I want to know about what you would think as a person understanding sociology about how did work evolve and change in just a short little bit. What is this sociology of the concept of work?
Yeah, so I mentioned my grandfathers, the welders. One of them grew up on a farm in Indiana growing corn, and then got drafted into World War I, and then moved to Detroit to make his fortune, and then did that for the rest of his life. But on a farm, you don't have a job. There's a lot of work to be done, but they don't have an organization chart with specific roles. And Elon Musk calling himself uh, uh, head guru or whatever.
King or something.
Yeah, what was it? Techno King. That's
Techno
right. He's the
King,
Techno
yes.
King. Nobody called themselves Techno King on the farm in Indiana. There's a bunch of work to be done, and people did the work, and they did it until the tasks were done, and the cows weren't and chickens weren't waiting for you. So there was work to be done, but there were not jobs. And jobs as we know them really morphed with the manufacturing economy, with the second industrial revolution. I read this amazing figure that the number of people living in cities went from 22% to 46% between 1880 and 1910. So basically, we went from a nation of farmers to a nation of urban dwellers in a generation. And that went along with people shifting to jobs. And now I feel what we're seeing now is a deconstruction of that world. If it's cheaper to pay by the shift or by the task, capitalism loves cheap. And so that's really the thing that's likely to win.
Sometimes we're encouraging students to find what they love to do, and so they won't have to work at all because they're doing what they love to do. But it doesn't seem like that is part of this. How do we get a joy out of being these entrepreneur worker type people?
In my last book, the last chapter was advice to graduates, and I saw that was sort of one of the quotes. I got a son who's turning 27 shortly and working in DC as a contractor. And he is a political science major, and I said, study whatever you want. I love the liberal arts, but if you don't learn Python and SQL, you will die penniless, homeless, and alone.
Become a philosophy major too.
This is yeah, but I learned Python and SQL. So he just said, yeah, I don't need any of that. And after he learned Python and SQL, he doubled his salary. And so I said, look, it's not that you live to code, your love of politics and the political process and social justice, that's great. Continue to have that passion, but nobody's going to hire somebody that is passionate but doesn't know how to do anything. And so if you learn the core job skills early on in your role, you might be doing the boring Python and SQL things. Later on, you're going to be the boss that is able to add more value and do more interesting work. But if you're the boss that doesn't know Python and SQL, your subordinates are going to think you're an idiot. If you're the one that doesn't know, if you don't know enough if you don't know what your subordinates are actually doing, they're not going to respect you. And so you really do want to put your time in the trenches. And my feeling about this is a lot of people that follow their passion want to do jobs that their 12-year-old selves might have loved. Like, I want to play basketball or be a firefighter or a ballet dancer or a chocolate taster or a bartender or a sports agent, or, stuff that makes sense to 12-year-olds. Any one of those jobs, if 12-year-olds like it, you won't get paid well. Veterinarian takes a lot of training and pays terribly because a lot of people dream of being veterinarians and there's an oversupply. So how about this? Find a way to be useful to our world. Choose a passion in making the world better, and you will find the role that fits with your talent. If you're doing a job that serves the world well, not, oh, I love chocolate or I love the Packers or whatever. Find a way to be of service to our world. There are so many problems to be solved out there. Find the ones that you care about, and you will be able to develop and use the right talents for that. Maybe it'll be Python and SQL early on, and maybe later it'll be being an entrepreneur that creates a way to employ people sort of coming out of hard situations, or that solves problems of access to care for the elderly. So choose a problem to be solved, and the passion will follow that, is my broad advice. And learn Python and SQL.
I have a couple of questions here from the audience. One, Tammy Martin asks, how will future workers determine what skills will be in demand to know what skills to learn or develop today with their, given the high education costs we have?
That's such a lovely question and a really hard one to answer. So one of my extremely brilliant doctoral students, Dr. Teddy DeWitt, who teaches at UMass Boston, did an analysis of what used to be called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, 1,000 different jobs. It's now called ONET, 20 years of data on 1,000 jobs in the US. And what he discovered is none of them sit still. We give advice like learn to be a welder. And then the Ford F-150 factory shifts from steel to aluminum. Well, that is not the flavor of welding that my grandfathers knew how to do. Or learn to be a plumber. Everybody needs plumbers. It turns out that a big chunk of plumbing today is data analysis and understanding solar. And if you walk into any modern bathroom that's got, solar panels and motion detectors and so on, plumbing is a high-tech job now. So I don't have a great answer for that. I do feel this is going to sound a little meta and a bit of a punt, but I hope not. The people that can figure out where are the emerging skills that need to be trained for, the world will beat a path to their door. The people that can figure out, so if truck drivers are rendered mostly irrelevant by self-driving trucks that at least work on the freeways, which seems not implausible, figure out what are the things that draw on the skills that truck drivers currently have and that they could be readily trained for. One of the things that we do that we shouldn't is say, all right, everybody trained to be a plumber, everyone trained to be a welder, because there's always need for that. A smarter thought would be, where are the people now? And think of them as vectors in n-dimensional space. What are the things not too distant from what they're already doing that shows us the shortest path that trains them to do something else? Like famously, Southwest Airlines allegedly never recruits flight attendants or flight crews from other airlines because they think that they've been trained the wrong way by the other guys. Instead, they prefer to hire social workers and teachers, because people that can deal with emotionally troubled children or clients, the people that can do what social workers do, you can train people to show how seatbelts go together, but it's a lot harder to train people with the skills that social workers have. So if we can think in that creative way, how do we go from the jobs we currently have? What is the shortest path to something else that's employable? I think that's a really crucial role for society, the people that can figure that out. That would be the manpowers of the future, is the people that understand, what the vectors are.
I know that the Lubar School has a code of conduct, and so does the UW Milwaukee. There's a question by Derek Van Mel. He says, are there examples of corporate codes of ethics that create responsibilities for behavior in their supply chain?
Wow, I love that. The one that I love best would be Ford Motor Company. And this is not just because I'm a big patriot or both my grandfathers worked there, but I've gotten to know one of their executives that oversaw their human rights code. And so when this is, I mentioned a couple of times nice things about SC Johnson. I really respect something about family businesses, the ability that the fact that they've got an eye on their legacy means that they think generations long in a way that Netflix thinks next week. But an SC Johnson or Ford is thinking our name is on that building.
For sure.
So one of the things that the Ford company has done is created a corporate human rights code that included a set of standards with teeth. And they weren't just don't be evil, which, by the way, the company that made that famous dropped it from their code 5 years ago. I'm not going to mention names, but I will say companies that used to say don't be evil have apparently beaten that back a little bit. But Ford's human rights code included access to fresh water as a core human right. And what that means in implementation is that for both Ford factories and their suppliers, they need to make sure that their manufacturing facilities do not deplete access to fresh water where they operate. I know that Milwaukee is the water city, right?
Well, we have a freshwater school in our school, yes.
No, which is fantastic to have an urban identity like that. So Ford Motor Company, they and their suppliers say, all right, we make Ford Fusions in Hermosillo, Mexico, and our human rights code requires that we not deplete the water table in Hermosillo and its surrounding area. And so we need to find a way to manufacture that puts fresh water back in the community, and that goes for our top tier suppliers. So I am pretty proud of Ford for doing that. And I could mention a lot of miscreants as well, but I will not, because it's Ethics Day and we want to give good examples.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to ask just one last question because time is coming to a close. When we have these apps for our work, it seems like we're always on call. We've heard of the problem of work-life balance, but how are we going to manage that in this new world that you're envisioning?
Yeah, really hard problem. I spent 3 years as associate dean, and I have to say, anyone that survives a dean job, hats off to you, because you never know when a new crisis is going to arise at 3 a.m. or where there's excitement on all dimensions. So some roles it's going to be pretty well impossible to get out of that. The deans are the residual claimants for trouble and surus, I think. But I would say one of the bright sides of the choosing your own shifts. So I sound very negative about sort of using an app to find work, but you could imagine a world where that was amazing. Like the people that most love being Uber drivers or TaskRabbits, the people that love it say, I work the shifts that I sign up for, and when I turn off the app, I am done. And so if I decide my mom has been really sick, she just got out of the hospital, I need to take a month off to take care of her, and I got to move down to Carbondale, Illinois for a month to look out for my mom. The shift work, the app-based work, means you can say, I'm just shutting off the app, so I'll be back in a month. But in some sense, there is a real appeal to being able to control your own time in that way. I mean, you could imagine a dream world. There was a famous political economist whose name escapes me that says, imagine this future world where you could be a hunter in the morning and a fisher in the afternoon and talk philosophy at night. Well,
John Maynard Keynes in 1936 was talking about that, essentially.
Well, that sounds pretty good to me. I mean, what it would look like today is you could be reading X-rays in the morning and driving for Uber in the afternoon and being a mashup DJ in the evening. But that sounds like a pretty good life. For some people, this is going to the all-you-can-eat buffet where you can try many cuisines. I mean, that sounds pretty good, but it's got to be underwritten by some basic level of security. I think that's the thing that we as a society need to figure out. How do we make it so that I'm an entrepreneur, but that doesn't mean that if I had a bad couple of weeks, my kid can't get medical care? I mean, it's great to be experimental and entrepreneurial, but we all need to have some basic level of safety and security so that we can take those risks. And I think that's the world that I would like to head towards, one where people can experiment and try different things and switch on for a week and then become a novelist and then take care of their elderly parents. I want to live in that world. We have to create it.
Well, on behalf of everyone at the Lubar School of Business and UWM in general, we just appreciate hearing about this, being motivated and seeing what the brave new world will be like as we enter it. Thank you very much, Dr. Jerry Davis.
Thank you so much, Professor Marcus and Dean Chari.